In April of 1922, I offered the world a map of ruins, and they mistook it for the territory itself. The wasteland emerged not as a lament for lost civilization, but as a diagnostic instrument, a spiritual stethoscope pressed against the chest of modernity. What I heard there was not the silence of death, but the irregular heartbeat of a culture between breaths, suspended between one spiritual epoch and another. You see, what confounded most readers then, and perhaps still confounds them now, is that they expected poetry to console, to offer easy reconciliation with their discomfort. Instead, I presented them with fragments precisely because fragmentation was their actual condition. Not to celebrate it, but to make it conscious. The wasteland is not a place you visit, it is where you already live, only now you might begin to recognize it. The true message was never despair. It was recognition, that moment when consciousness awakens to its own predicament and discovers, in that very awakening, the first stirring of what might yet be redeemed. This is what I saw that others could not, that spiritual drought precedes the rain, that cultural disintegration precedes authentic renewal, and that only by mapping the wasteland accurately could we ever hope to find our way through it to whatever lies beyond. Chapter 1: The Landscape of Broken Images. What I witnessed in those years following the Great War was not merely political upheaval or economic disruption, but something far more profound, the collapse of a coherent symbolic universe. The old certainties, religious, cultural, philosophical, had not simply been questioned, they had been pulverized in the trenches, scattered like the debris I would later arrange into verse. But here was my crucial insight: this fragmentation was not an accident of history. It was the inevitable result of a culture that had gradually lost touch with the sources of its own spiritual vitality. The wasteland was not created by the war was simply the wasteland revealing itself with brutal clarity. Consider the opening lines: April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land. Most readers heard only nihilistic despair. What I intended was a precise diagnosis of spiritual condition. April is cruel precisely because it promises renewal that a spiritually barren culture cannot sustain. The lilacs breed, but in dead land, life force asserting itself through forms that can no longer nourish it. This is what I saw that others missed. Modern civilization had become expert at producing the external forms of cultural life while hollowing out their spiritual content. Rituals without meaning, traditions without understanding, symbols divorced from the realities they once embodied. The wasteland was not a place of no water, but a place where water, when it came, could not be recognized or received. The broken images scattered throughout the poem, the handful of dust, the drowned sailor, the empty chapel, these were not random selections from a disordered mind. They were precise indicators of a culture's spiritual predicament. Each fragment pointed toward what had been lost and, simultaneously, toward what might yet be recovered if consciousness could be awakened to the actual nature of its condition. This required a new kind of poetry, one that could function as both mirror and lamp, reflecting accurately the fragmented condition while simultaneously illuminating the possibilities hidden within that very fragmentation. The wasteland was not the enemy, it was the necessary preparation for whatever authentic renewal might follow. Chapter 2: The Death of Linear Meaning. Traditional narrative had become impossible because the experience it purported to represent no longer existed. The old stories, of heroic journeys, moral progress, providential history, these had been revealed as beautiful fictions that could no longer contain the actual texture of modern consciousness. What was needed was not better stories, but a more honest acknowledgement of how consciousness actually operates in conditions of cultural breakdown. This is why the wasteland moves as it does, through sudden shifts and unexpected juxtapositions. Not because I sought to confuse readers, but because confusion was the authentic condition that needed to be mapped. The mind in spiritual crisis does not proceed logically from premise to conclusion, it leaps, associates, fragments, circles back upon itself, seeks connections that may or may not exist. But, and this is crucial, this apparent disorder was not random. It followed what I came to understand as a deeper logic, the logic of consciousness seeking its way through debris toward whatever authentic foundation might remain. Each fragment was placed with precision, not according to narrative sequence, but according to spiritual necessity. Consider the movement from the burial of the dead through a game of chess to the fire sermon. These are not merely thematic sections, they represent stages in the soul's recognition of its predicament. First, the acknowledgement that old forms of life have indeed died and require burial. Then, the recognition that relationships conducted without spiritual foundation become elaborate games, mechanical interactions that generate sound and fury while signifying nothing essential. Finally, the understanding that purification, the fire of authentic spiritual discipline, becomes necessary if consciousness is to move beyond mere diagnosis toward actual healing. What I saw that others could not was that this nonlinear movement was itself a form of meaning, perhaps the only form adequate to the spiritual condition I was attempting to map. Linear meaning assumes a stable ground from which to proceed, but what happens when the ground itself has become questionable? Then you must learn to think, and to make poetry, in a different way entirely. The apparent chaos of the poem was actually a rigorously controlled experiment in spiritual cartography. Each fragmentation was deliberate, each juxtaposition calculated to produce in readers the shock of recognition. This is how consciousness actually moves when it finds itself suspended between dying certainties and not yet born possibilities. Chapter 3: The Hidden Unity Behind Chaos. What appeared to be formless fragmentation was actually held together by an invisible architecture, one that operated not according to logical argument but according to spiritual law. The wasteland was unified, but its unity belonged to a different order than readers had been trained to recognize. This unity revealed itself through what I called the mythical method, the discovery that beneath the surface chaos of modern experience, certain archetypal patterns continued to assert themselves. The quest for the Grail, the seasonal cycle of death and renewal, the journey through different levels of spiritual understanding, these patterns provided the underlying structure that gave coherence to apparent randomness. But here was my crucial insight: these patterns could not be applied externally, like decorative overlays on modern material. They had to be discovered arising spontaneously from within contemporary experience itself. The myth was not something added to modern life, it was something still alive within modern life, though obscured by layers of cultural debris that prevented its recognition. This is why the poem moves through so many voices, so many languages, so many cultural references. Not to display erudition, but to demonstrate that the same spiritual predicament manifests across all cultures and epochs. The London office worker and the ancient fertility priest, the neurotic socialite and the medieval knight, all participate in the same fundamental drama of consciousness seeking its way from spiritual aridity toward authentic renewal. The Sanskrit conclusion, dada, diadvam, damayata, was not an exotic ornament but the discovery of universal wisdom that transcends particular cultural formulations. Give, sympathize, control. These imperatives emerged not from Indian philosophy imposed upon Western experience, but from the recognition of what any consciousness must do if it seeks to move beyond the wasteland condition. What I saw that others missed was that chaos and unity are not opposites but different aspects of the same spiritual reality. The fragmentation was real and had to be acknowledged honestly. But within and through that fragmentation, deeper patterns of meaning continued to operate. The poem's task was to make those patterns visible without destroying the authentic experience of fragmentation that was their necessary starting point. This required a new kind of artistic unity, one that could contain multiplicity without reducing it to false simplification. The wasteland achieved this by becoming what I called an objective correlative, not for any single emotion or idea, but for the entire complex of spiritual condition that characterized consciousness suspended between death and rebirth. Chapter 4: The Technology of Spiritual Awakening. Poetry, I discovered, could function as a precise instrument for spiritual diagnosis and, potentially, for spiritual healing. But this required abandoning romantic notions about poetry as emotional expression or aesthetic decoration. What was needed was a more rigorous understanding of how language operates upon consciousness, how carefully arranged words could produce specific effects in the reader's spiritual condition. The technique I developed involved what might be called controlled fragmentation. Each break in the poem's surface, each shift in voice, each unexpected juxtaposition, each allusion to other texts, was calculated to reproduce in readers the experience of consciousness awakening to its own fragmented condition. The poem became a technology for making the wasteland visible. But visibility was only the first step. The deeper purpose was to create in readers the capacity for what I called impersonal experience, the ability to recognize their individual predicament as participation in universal spiritual patterns. This required moving beyond merely personal response toward what might be called archetypal recognition. Consider the technique of multiple voices that runs throughout the poem. The fortune teller, the pub conversation, the typist's mechanical encounter, the Thames daughters. These are not character studies in the conventional sense. They are windows into different aspects of the same spiritual condition, different refractions of the same light passing through the prism of contemporary consciousness. What I saw that others could not was that authentic spiritual art must be simultaneously deeply personal and completely impersonal. Personal because it must engage the reader's actual lived experience, impersonal because it must transcend the limitations of merely individual perspective to touch whatever remains universal in human nature. This is why the poem's imagery moves constantly between the most intimate psychological states and the vastest cosmic patterns. The individual's sexual anxiety and the seasonal cycle of vegetation, the London commuter's morning routine and the ancient ritual of sacrifice, these are not unrelated phenomena requiring forced connection, but different scales of the same spiritual reality seeking recognition and expression. The objective correlative became not just a technique but a spiritual discipline. Instead of imposing my personal emotions upon the reader, I sought to discover those precise combinations of image, rhythm, and reference that would awaken in readers their own authentic spiritual response. The poem became a mechanism for producing in others the same quality of consciousness that had been produced in me through years of spiritual and artistic struggle. This required extraordinary precision in the selection and arrangement of every element. Nothing could be merely atmospheric or decorative, everything must contribute to the poem's function as an instrument of spiritual awakening. Chapter 5: The American Prophetic Tradition. Though I wrote The Waste Land while living in London, its spiritual technology was perfectly adapted to the American condition, perhaps even more so than to the European. For America had always been, in its deepest identity, a culture of spiritual experiment, a civilization founded upon the possibility of renewal, of beginning again in conditions that might permit more authentic forms of human flourishing. But by 1922, this original American promise had become complicated by the same forces of cultural fragmentation that afflicted all modern societies. The difference was that Americans retained, often unconsciously, a stronger expectation that renewal was possible, that wastelands were meant to be transformed into gardens. This made both the wound and the potential healing more acute. What I recognized was that the wasteland spoke directly to the American prophetic tradition that runs from the Puritans through Emerson and Whitman to the spiritual seekers of the 20th century. This tradition has always insisted that spiritual condition determines social reality, that consciousness must be transformed before culture can be renewed, that authentic change must begin from within and work outward through individuals capable of sustaining higher forms of spiritual life. The poem's technique of assembling fragments into new wholes particularly suited American experience, which had always been a matter of creating coherent identity from diverse elements. The difference was that previous generations of Americans had operated with clear spiritual and cultural frameworks for this assembly. By the 1920s, those frameworks had themselves become fragmented, requiring new methods of synthesis. This is why the poem's movement toward the Sanskrit conclusion was not an abandonment of Western culture but a fulfillment of America's original promise as a place where the best wisdom of all traditions might be preserved and renewed. Dada, diadvam, damayata, give, sympathize, control. These imperatives align perfectly with the deepest American aspiration to create forms of life that honor both individual freedom and social responsibility. What I saw that others missed was that America's spiritual crisis was also America's spiritual opportunity. The very forces that had created the wasteland condition, individualism divorced from tradition, progress pursued without wisdom, freedom separated from spiritual discipline, these same forces, properly understood and redirected, contained the energy necessary for authentic renewal. The poem became a map not only of spiritual predicament but of spiritual possibility. Its fragmentation pointed toward new forms of unity, its multiple voices suggested new possibilities for harmony, its movement through death toward potential rebirth aligned with America's own mythological understanding of itself as a culture capable of perpetual renewal. But this renewal could not be achieved through mere optimism or technological innovation. It required the kind of rigorous spiritual discipline that the poem itself embodied, the willingness to face honestly the full extent of cultural and personal fragmentation before attempting any synthesis that might prove durable. Chapter 6: The Practice of Redemptive Attention. The deepest teaching of the wasteland was not contained in any particular passage or symbol, but in the quality of attention the poem both required and cultivated. Reading it properly demanded a new kind of consciousness, one capable of holding multiple contradictions simultaneously, of finding meaning in apparent meaninglessness, of discovering unity through rather than despite fragmentation. This was not merely an aesthetic exercise but a spiritual discipline. The poem functioned as what might be called a contemplative technology, a carefully constructed environment for developing those capacities of attention that spiritual tradition has always recognized as necessary for authentic insight. But unlike traditional contemplative practices, this technology was specifically adapted to modern conditions, to consciousness already fragmented by urban experience, mass media, and cultural dislocation. What I discovered was that meaning, under modern conditions, could not be received passively but had to be actively constructed through the reader's own spiritual labor. The poem provided materials, images, rhythms, allusions, juxtapositions, but meaning emerged only through the reader's willingness to engage in the kind of contemplative assembly that the poem itself demonstrated. This required what I came to understand as redemptive attention, the capacity to find spiritual significance in apparently degraded material. The typist's mechanical sexual encounter, the pub conversation about abortion, the neurotic socialite's empty chatter, these scenes became meaningful not through being transformed into something other than what they were, but through being seen with sufficient depth and compassion to reveal the spiritual drama hidden within their apparent triviality. This was perhaps my most radical insight, that the sacred was not absent from modern experience but only unrecognized, that spiritual reality continued to manifest itself through contemporary forms but required new organs of perception to be detected. The wasteland was not a place where God was dead, but a place where consciousness had become temporarily incapable of recognizing divine presence operating through unfamiliar modes. The poem's fragmented structure thus became a training ground for the kind of consciousness capable of perceiving unity in multiplicity, meaning in chaos, sacred in secular. Each reading became an opportunity to practice the spiritual skills necessary for navigating modern life with wisdom rather than mere survival. What I saw that others could not was that this practice was not merely individual but potentially collective. As more readers developed the capacity for redemptive attention, the culture itself might gradually become capable of supporting forms of life that honored both complexity and unity, both individual authenticity and social coherence. The wasteland was thus both diagnosis and prescription, both map of spiritual predicament and instrument of spiritual healing. Chapter 7. The Rain That Always Comes. The poem's final movement, What the Thunder Said, revealed what had been implicit throughout, that the wasteland condition, however authentic and necessary, was not final. Consciousness that had undergone sufficient purification through honest confrontation with its own fragmented condition would eventually become capable of receiving whatever spiritual nourishment remained available in the world. But this rain, when it came, would not restore the old certainties or rebuild the old cultural forms. It would water new growth, support new forms of spiritual life adapted to post-traditional conditions. The consciousness that emerged from the wasteland experience would be simultaneously more humble and more mature, more aware of its limitations and more capable of authentic response to whatever grace might be offered. This is what I saw that others missed. The wasteland was not punishment but preparation, not the end of spiritual possibility but its necessary beginning under modern conditions. The suffering was real and had to be fully experienced, but it was suffering with a purpose, the dismantling of false foundations so that authentic ones might eventually be discovered or constructed. The Sanskrit conclusion represented not escape from Western culture but its deepest fulfillment. Dada, Dayadvam, Damayata, these imperatives emerged from the poem's own spiritual logic, not as foreign impositions but as the universal wisdom that any consciousness discovers when it moves through fragmentation toward authentic integration. Give, not from abundance but from recognition that hoarding spiritual goods destroys them, that consciousness realizes itself only through generous expenditure. Sympathize, not as emotional identification but as the recognition that individual suffering participates in universal patterns of death and renewal. Control, not as domination but as the spiritual discipline necessary to sustain whatever higher forms of life become possible. The poem ends not with resolution but with the promise of continued work. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Consciousness that has undergone the wasteland experience does not achieve final enlightenment but develops the capacity for ongoing spiritual construction using whatever materials remain available, including, prominently, the fragments of broken cultural forms that can be renewed through being understood differently. What I offered was not comfort but competence, the spiritual skills necessary for living authentically in conditions that would remain, for the foreseeable future, fragmentary and uncertain. The wasteland would not disappear, but consciousness could learn to inhabit it differently, to find in its apparent barrenness the hidden seeds of whatever renewal might yet prove possible. This was my true message, that spiritual drought precedes spiritual rain, that cultural breakdown precedes cultural renewal, and that consciousness capable of mapping its own wasteland accurately was consciousness prepared to receive whatever grace the future might offer. Conclusion. What I saw in 1922 continues to unfold in your time, perhaps with even greater clarity. The wasteland was never a place but a condition of consciousness, never a historical period but a spiritual predicament that recurs whenever cultures lose touch with the sources of their own vitality. My poem was not prophecy but diagnosis, not lamentation but spiritual technology. The true message was always this, that consciousness capable of mapping its own fragmentation accurately is consciousness preparing for its own renewal. The fragments you live among are not evidence of final collapse but materials for whatever authentic synthesis your generation might prove capable of constructing. The rain that I heard approaching at the poem's end, that rain continues to approach. It gathers in the consciousness of each reader who discovers, through honest engagement with contemporary spiritual predicament, that meaning is not given but made, that unity is not inherited but achieved, That the sacred is not absent but waiting to be recognized through sufficiently patient and compassionate attention. Your wasteland is not my wasteland, but the skills remain the same, the willingness to face fragmentation honestly, the capacity to find meaning through contemplative assembly of broken pieces, the recognition that spiritual drought precedes spiritual rain. These fragments you have, shore them against your ruins. The work continues.